what?
Oh, I've never seen that before for multiple choice.
Oh, all right. So, physiology. So for this one, I think what we'll do with this hour is just QA questions, that kind of a thing, because I don't have a whole spiel prepared. So if there's any particular question, slide, or anything like that, then let's take it.
Yeah, so what we went over last Tuesday was blood pressure.
Okay.
And I can show you those. You don't have to give us the answers, but I'll show you the worksheet that he handed out. So that's the topic.
Okay.
And then on Monday, we're doing some questions on the ECG and cardiac cycle.
Okay.
So I don't know if we can maybe do a review of that, and here's the topics for that. That's why I came, because I want to be ready for Monday. Yeah. I was in that group that kept getting answers wrong. Like, remember the first class? And it was like, why would you pick me? I still don't understand why you picked me. I don't know what our problem was with it. Yeah. We were in that group. So my grade is not that high.
All right, so a couple concepts that we can go through. How do you calculate mean arterial pressure? There's more than one way, but we'll go over the one that's talked about here. Something else that we can do is regulating who gets blood, where, when, why. So basically blood control. Besides the heart, the rest of the body can say, I want blood or I don't want blood. The heart also can change based on your exercising. Let's change something, because otherwise we don't have enough. We'll hit that, and then, so those are some topics that we'll hit. Are there any other questions before we dive into stuff like that, though?
We can start anywhere, because I don't know what we did.
Yeah, there's
blood.
Yeah.
There's a lot of mathematical equations.
Yeah.
A lot of equations.
That's what he
I don't know.
talked
I
about.
was following him with the study guide, and I didn't understand why it was talking about the whole nother. It was not mentioned. No, it's like learn how to do it. So
Okay.
Topics that he thinks we should know.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so 7 and 8, I was trying to find them in his slides, and I wasn't really following what the changes were, and he's dotted line, up and left, and I was like,
Gotcha. Let's start with the exercise physiology. Advantage return change.
I can keep those up there for a while if you want. I don't need them.
All right. So, blood supply during exercise.
It's not due.
It's not upgraded.
What is it to do?
So-
I see what's going
That's the one
on.
I'm memory. Did that happen?
He passed it out.
He passed it out, but it's not a graded one, so we're gonna go over it.
Well, when it's just falling apart.
Okay, so we got, let's just make it a circle. All right, so we got blood going through the circulation, the systemic system, and there's a certain amount of blood there. If we put more blood in, blood pressure would go up. If we took blood out, blood pressure would go down. One of the places that we need to make sure blood gets to is, let's branch it off, the carotid. All right, needs to make it up to the brain. So if you have low blood pressure, the first place that's going to feel it is the top of the body, the brain. So that's why low blood pressure is a big deal, and that's why people pass out, is literally the brain's just not getting any blood. So when we are resting, we don't want to send blood to places that it's not needed. And so if we have muscle tissue to stay alive doesn't need a frick ton of blood. It needs a normalish amount of blood. Let's just call it that because that's sciencey. All right, needs normalish blood. When we are using muscle tissue, there are other blood supply options that are usually closed off. The smooth muscle right there is usually contracted around some of the arteries, some of the small arteries leading to the muscles, and that makes so that we don't send blood that way. We have a lot of muscles in our body. If all of these opened at the same time, then blood would have a lot more space to be in because it would be through the muscle, it would be through those arteries, and it would do that throughout the whole body. And we would actually have a really big drop in blood pressure. And that would cause us probably to pass out, and it would be dangerous. So we only open these when we're exercising. When the muscle cells say that we need more blood, we need more oxygen, they will give off something called adenosine. Adenosine will go to the smooth muscle and the endothelial cells around the arteries. And NO, nitric oxide, will be released, and the nitric oxide is going to go ahead and act on the smooth muscle to relax it. And that will open up the blood flow to that muscle. Okay, great. Are we going to pass out? Two things. We might be opening it only to one muscle, not to every muscle. That's not nearly as much blood that's going to be taken out of the main circulation, if you want to think of it that way. Number two, when we're exercising, our heart rate goes up, and how hard our heart pumps also increases. And those are going to increase blood pressure.
What increases blood pressure?
The heart beating harder and faster. Harder, if the heart beats harder, we call that positive inotropy, or a positive inotropic effect. If it beats faster, it usually does both at the same time. We have special names for each of them. It's going to be positive chronotropy. If anyone's played Chrono Trigger, you know that chrono means time. And if you haven't, you had a life. Good job. So, inotropy and chronotropy, those go up during exercise, and that's these can be controlled by a couple different things. How do we tell the heart to do this? There are beta 2 adrenergic receptors. And if they get epinephrine or norepi, among a couple other things, but those are the big ones, then it turns on the beta 2 receptors, and those go through the beta 2. So you have the G protein pathways that can make cyclic AMP, CAMP, CAMP, however you want to pronounce it. And those pathways will go and turn on either for inotropy, you're going to have more calcium released during the plateau phase that we talked about recently. You remember the plateau phase?
Calcium.
Yeah, and so if we have more calcium coming out, that plateau phase gets longer. And that plateau phase signifies how long the muscles are squeezing, and the longer they're doing it, the harder they're doing it. So inotropy is when you have increased calcium release. So they're still doing their normal thing, except they're opening more calcium channels, so the plateau phase lasts longer, so they squeeze harder. That's for inotropy. Chronotropy is going to be in the pacemaker cells. If you remember, let's see, let's make that better. Make it much more better. All right. Spike up and spike down and leak up, spike up, down, leak up. So we have phase 4 where it's usually the resting phase, but in the SA node or the AV node, the pacemaker cells, they're always depolarizing because they have those funny channels. So these are sodium funny channels where sodium is constantly leaking. And since sodium is a positive ion, if sodium leaks out, then we continually are going to get some depolarization here. And I said out, I meant in. All right. Positive chronotropy is that we have more channels open to let more positive ions in. I believe that it's just more sodium channels. You'll have to double check on that. But basically, instead of this amount of time, this amount of time, this amount of time for each action potential, if you have more positives coming in, then you have a steeper curve and you'll hit another action potential faster, and then you'll have a steeper curve again because the depolarization is going to be faster because you have more positive ions coming in. So that increases your heart rate. Does that make sense? Okay. So.
And this is stage 4 is the depolarization?
Stage 4 is usually the resting phase. So it's.
But why is it on that side of the paper? I'm used to seeing it from left to right and then right. Okay.
It's kind of funny. It starts at phase 4 when it's in the sinoatrial nodes, and so you actually have 0 coming next. All right, so, and that's funny. This one you start with 0, 1, 2, 3, and then 4. But this one you do start with 4 because you're looking at the depolarization. So notice up here that this one is flat. No ions are being moved. So if up here is going to be more positive and down here is more negative, if we add positive ions to the cell, then it will move up. If we take them away, then it will move down. So in most cells, including the cardiac muscle cells, so this is for muscle cells, you would have no ions moving during the resting phase. In the pacemaker cells, which are the sinoatrial or AV node, they don't ever have a real resting phase. They have little holes in them. So let's draw one. It's got a hole, and it's always leaking some sodium. And that sodium wants to come in. And that sodium continues to build up positive charges slowly. And it keeps having more and more come in. And so you never have it resting. It's always progressing towards the positive direction. Once you hit a certain level of positivity in the cell, then you open up really big channels and have a lot of stuff come in. And that's when you have this big spike. And so you'd have a lot of some kind of positive ion. In this case, it's calcium. But it's still positive, just like this is positive. And so now you have even more positive stuff in there, and it can come in really fast because there's a lot of channels. That makes it move up to the positive side really fast because this is just some positives, lots of positives. Now we're up here. When we're at the very top, there's a little line right here that if you ever get this positive, there are some doors that automatically open that let some positive things out. Because potassium always wants to leave, sodium always wants to come in, calcium always wants to come in, but potassium always wants to leave. So we're going to open those potassium doors, and it's going to go down really fast because we also closed all the calcium doors. So we have positive not coming in anymore very much, and a lot of potassium leaving. So lots of positive is leaving. And then once we're down here, these guys close, and what do we have left? The funny channels. The funny channels never close, where we open some other doors, and then the doors do their fun stuff, and then funny channels just keep on leaking forever. So when we do chronotropy, we're just opening more sodium channels, more leak channels, to let in positive charges faster. And so That means during the resting phase, we move up at a steeper angle. So, because we get more positives faster. Each one of these peaks is considered a heartbeat, or what begins a heartbeat. So the faster we get to a peak, I'll draw those down here. If we did it faster, then it would be something like this. And that's far more peaks in the same amount of time. So this would be, let's say this is 60 beats. This would be 120 beats per minute. So by having the beta-2 adrenergic receptor stimulated, we will go ahead, we'll have more calcium released for the muscles to be able to squeeze harder. We'll also have more positive ion channels opened so that we depolarize faster. Any questions on that?
For the calcium, does that change how that curve looks? Like for the plateau phase, phase 2, does that change with the increased calcium?
Yes. So if we had normal calcium, then the plateau phase would be shorter. The plateau phase length increases when you have more calcium, because calcium just is holding the charge up because it's a very positive ion. So the more of it you have, the more it holds it towards the positive side of the chart. So it'll hold it there. And the longer, that whole plateau phase is the squeezing that's going on. So the longer you have it, the longer you're squeezing. Any other questions? Okay, so going back to exercise physiology, this is going to be how you speed up the heart. This is how muscles will get some blood supply. And so this sending blood to your muscles will drop your blood pressure. Your heart is going to do this to increase your blood pressure back up again. Your inotropy and chronotropy effects. There's something else that happens. Have you guys ever seen anyone wearing compression stockings? Compression stockings, we actually have a normal, natural, physiological compression stocking. So in the legs, that's a leg. Go figure, we have blood vessels. And because the legs are at the bottom of the body, they have a bunch of, so if you guys are familiar with water column pressure, basically it means that water at the bottom of a column, so if this is full of water, the water at the bottom has a bunch of water resting on top of it, so it has the highest pressure, whereas at the top, it's not very, very high pressure. This is why divers, if you dive really deep, you can have your ears pop, and you can have, it feels like you are being squeezed really tight. And if you come up really fast, then you change pressure really fast, and that can give you some problems. Basically, the deeper you are underneath water, the higher the pressure that water is under. Our legs have more stuff on top of them, more water on top of them weighing down on it, and so there's more pressure in the blood down there. And that is because of gravity, and it's because there's a bunch on top. And so the veins, which I drew in red because I'm that kind of nice person, the veins are going to bulge out naturally because you have more blood trying to stay there, and it will stretch the veins out. They have compliance to be able to do that, stretchiness. Now, if you want this blood, however, to get back to the heart and maybe to the brain, because you don't want all your blood pooling down in your legs, you can either wear compression stockings or the smooth muscle around the veins, around the blood vessels, have little receptors, and they're alpha-1 receptors. And if epi or norepi contacts those receptors, then the smooth muscle ring will go ahead and contract. And it will act like a compression stocking, and the smooth muscle is around all of this. And so it will contract and force the blood back into a tube-like shape and that means that all the blood that was pooling will be forced up towards the heart. So you have alpha 1 receptors down here, you have beta 2 receptors in the heart, and they're both working together to get blood moving through the body. Muscles, something else. If you have all of this, so when you exercise, all of this will go on, where you have blood moving up and all that kind of stuff, raise your blood pressure. I believe Professor Schmidt probably mentioned this to you. If you only work out one muscle group, or if you do a static muscle group, then your blood pressure goes up a lot more than if you're doing full body movement. And that's because all of this is raising blood pressure. How much is lowering blood pressure depends on how many muscles are working. How many extra avenues of blood did you open up? So if you only opened up one, you have a bunch of blood pressure rising and only a little bit that's lowering it. If you do full body exercise, then you have a bunch that's raising it, and a bunch of muscles that are then taking up the extra blood pressure.
So you said with the one muscle, you have a lot that's raising it up and a little that's raising it down because it's only one?
Right.
But how is it a lot raising it up if you still have one?
So the raising up doesn't care how many muscles are working.
Oh, but the raising down does.
Yeah, the raising down does.
Right. Oh, whatever.
So, good deal. One other thing on the resting side, rather than the exercise side, you can also have the, so your guts, your digestive tract, that uses a lot of blood when it's digesting food. When it's not digesting food, it doesn't need it. Or when we need that blood elsewhere. So during exercise, this is going to be our GI tract blood supply. Usually it gets a lot. Quite a bit goes there. You can also trigger the smooth muscle around these to tighten, and so that they get much less blood supply. And that makes so that you have more blood going into the main circulation, and that also, just like this one down here, this will also increase your blood pressure. So there's 3 ways for increasing blood pressure. GI tract is not going to have blood supply. When you're resting, you would then open that up a lot more. When you eat, you'd open that a lot more. Have any of you guys ever eaten like a big meal and then gone and exercised?
Get a cramp.
Yeah, you get a cramp. And that's because your GI tract doesn't have the blood supply to handle all the food, and so then you get a cramp because it doesn't have the oxygen to process it.
That way they're like, wait 30 minutes after you eat meals to like swim.
Yes, exactly.
I heard that we're not supposed to take a shower right after we eat. Right? Is that because it's lower the blood pressure or something?
I haven't really heard that one.
Because we're digesting?
Not taking a shower right after we
Like
eat.
the hot water takes the blood.
I don't know, someone told me.
Hot water does dilate blood vessels, and so if you were right on the edge of having enough blood or not, then maybe that would do it. But honestly, I haven't heard that. Once you've eaten, don't take a shower. If I had to guess, that's probably someone extrapolating from the don't go swimming, and it's like, stay away from any water, and it's probably okay.
Taylor, are you recording this?
Yes. Yeah, and go for it. All right, and let's see, what else do we have? So, Karatikoff is just when, so the Karatikoff sounds are just when blood, if you have a blood pressure cuff and it's squeezing on an artery and blood isn't getting by, then you're not going to hear any sound because blood's not going by. But if you make so that it can get by during the systole, when it's the highest pressure, then the sound of it going by during that is the Karatikoff sound. And so it's just being squeezed past. And it becomes turbulent because it's been squished through a narrow place. Instead of laminar flow, you have turbulent flow, and that's what you're hearing. So artery, which is now in blue because I really like using opposite colors, that is pinched down by your blood pressure cuff, but during systole, the pressure goes up enough to open it just a little bit, and you squeeze some through. That squeezing through makes the water or blood, whenever I think of laminar and turbulent flow, I go back to water. Instead of having a smooth flow like this, which is laminar, it becomes turbulent because it had to squeeze through. And that turbulent flow gives a sound. And that's the carotid cough. All right.
And then you had that one slide that had the squiggles that got
No, it's not
bigger,
really in
but-
clinic when I explain it to them.
All right. One of these says, why does central blood volume drop when you stand up? Anybody want to take a stab? Why would blood pressure go down when you stood up?
It's not moving up fast enough or something.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't
It's
reached that
pulling
part
down.
yet. It went up fast.
It's being pulled down. So, some of those answers sounded good, the parts of them that I could hear. So, when you're sitting down, your water column pressure is shorter. And so you have less that is right on top of each other, meaning that your pressure doesn't build up as much. And when you stand up, you have more pressure down at the bottom, and you also are going to have gravity taking a larger role because your water column is larger. And I feel like I'm explaining this in the most complicated way possible. When you stand up, you have the greater pressure at the bottom causes it to pool at the bottom. And so then your leg arteries have to take the time to squeeze it back into a normal tube shape because all of a sudden there's pressure to let it bulge and pool at the bottom of your legs. And so then the smooth muscle has to squeeze it back in so that it moves back to the top. So why do we have problems passing out? Because when we stand up, blood tends to pool in our legs because it gets pressurized down there. Does that make sense? Then we have a reduced blood volume. Any questions?
So, like, sometimes I even notice, like, if I stand up quickly, then I feel this, but if I slow down, I don't. So, is the standing up slowly given time for that blood to go back to the top?
Yes, it's giving time for the smooth muscle to react. So the smooth muscle, if you stand up really fast, the smooth muscle might not be able to tighten quickly enough. The nerves might not transmit, the muscle might be too slow, might not transmit quickly enough from the baroreceptors that tell them to. So you have baroreceptors in your neck that detect pressure. If they detect the pressure go down, they send nerve impulse down to the smooth muscle in the legs and say contract, and then the smooth muscles contract. Any part of that process can get slowed down, and if it does, then if you stand up fast, you have a bit of time where you have a bunch of blood that pools down here, and then it doesn't when you have it pooling down here, then that means you have less blood going to your brain because it's at the top.
So what's controlling the smooth muscle would be epinephrine going to the alpha-1 receptors to contract?
Yes, and the epinephrine is usually from a nerve rather than in the bloodstream. You can have it in the bloodstream if you're like, fight or flight, bear kind of a thing. But epinephrine would be the neurotransmitter that's coming from a nerve. And the nerve is going to be turned on by the baroreceptors in the neck. All right. So, let's see. Mean arterial pressure. Mean arterial pressure can be calculated. So if you have systolic, and that's at 140, and then you have diastolic, and that's at Let's have someone with a high blood pressure problem. 100. Don't do that. But we did it. We spend less time in systolic than we do in diastolic. If we were going to average the blood pressure, we know it would be in between these two numbers, right? It can't be below diastolic. It can't be above systolic. It's going to be in between. And we spend 1/3 of our time in systolic, roughly, and 2/3 in diastolic. And so if we have, it needs to be somewhere in between here. It should be closer to diastolic because we spend more time there. Then there's two ways we can do this. I'll show you the way that's probably what was in the slides, if I remember. That was when it would be systolic minus diastolic. Which in this case would equal 40. And then you would divide this by 3. Let's see, 40 divided by 3, that should be 13.3. 13.3, and then you add the diastolic, and that gives you your mean arterial pressure. The reason we're adding the diastolic is because, well, first of all, we know it has to be in between these two, and we're just trying to find what is 1/3 of the way up between these two, because 1/3 is in systolic, 2/3 in diastolic, so we're going to move it towards the systolic by 1/3 of the difference. If we never had systolic, we'd just keep it at diastolic. So what's pulling it towards the higher number is just the 1/3 of the time we're spending in systolic. So we give the systolic amount 1/3 of weight, so we'll increase it by 1/3 of the distance it takes to reach the systolic. So 1/3 of this would be 113.3. And so systolic minus diastolic just gives you how far apart are these. So what's the 1/3 that we should be traveling? 1/3 of 40, because that's how far the journey is. And I can tell that I'm getting a little bit swooshy in the head. So did that make any sense? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Some sense is better than no sense. All right. That's why I don't keep change. Okay. Why does blood flow increase to active skeletal muscle tissue? Can you guys tell me that one? To send oxygen. Yep, you're burning oxygen. Why does the...
My brain isn't working.
Ooh. Good. All right. I don't want to go through his whole... It's a not for grade worksheet, but I still don't want to go through the whole thing on a recording. But what's another good one? Heart rate changer.
I don't understand 7 or 8.
7 or 8. Oh, cool. Okay, so 7 talks about the Starling curve. The Starling curve is actually, we kind of talked about it indirectly, inotropy. So the Starling curve is how hard does the heart usually squish blood with a given volume. And during exercise, we squish blood harder, right? And so that means that we would move this curve so that it was higher. So going up means harder contractions, not the pregnancy kind. And that would be what we call positive inotropic effect. And so the Starling curve is just a way of measuring pressure or strength of contraction versus volume. How does volume play into this? if you guys imagine, did I talk about the water balloon in here ever? No? Okay. Yes? Maybe? It's where
Can
you,
you talk about it in relation
Water
to
balloon.
fibrillation and pressure?
okay.
As a balloon.
Oh, okay. Different water balloon.
Okay.
So this is one.
I think it was the day that I was.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. So
They were
recoil.
on the video.
Yeah. And also it was like there was an anatomy test the next day. It didn't like,
Oh.
it's like,
Oh,
please
wow.
study for anatomy.
Good.
It's like, whatever. So it doesn't hurt my feelings. Do what you need to do. Water balloon. Starling curve is talking about how you can have recoil that has nothing to do with your muscles actually squeezing harder. It's like you take one of those small water balloons that's really hard to blow up, and if you put in a little bit of water, then when you stop, when you take the water spigot off, it'll spray the water out. If you put in more water, it'll spray it out harder because it wants to get back to its original shape. And so the more you stretch it, the harder it'll go back to where it came from, up to a point. If you stretch it out a lot, it finally gets to the point where it's like stretched beyond being able to go back to its natural shape.
Is that what those cardioglycosides, yeah.
Cardioglycosides are related to this. They help you increase the contraction.
But if you take
Not-
too much, then is that over zone that you're talking
Yes, that's part of it. So if you take cardiac glycosides, you'll make the muscles squeeze harder, but that's not recoil. Recoil is when you've just stretched something and then it wants to go back to its normal shape, and it's not related to muscles directly. And so the Starling curve is talking about volume to squeezing, but you can get the squeezing, I should say the Starling curve includes both recoil and contraction.
Okay.
The volume part of it is talking about the recoil. You put more blood in and you have more recoil. You also do get more leverage for muscular contraction, so I guess it is both. But the part that I want to get across is the recoil. And I can tell that that's about as clear as I'm going to be able to speak tonight. So you increase volume, you increase recoil because it wants to go back to its normal shape. You also give it something that's better to hold on to and squeeze, and so it can get better leverage. And so that also increases the amount of force it can do as you increase the volume. If you want to increase the amount of force at a given volume, then you can either use a drug, cardiac glycosides like digoxin, or you can have epinephrine, which will do very similar things, where it makes it squeeze harder through the inotropic effects that we talked about with the calcium plateau. So, any questions on that? That'll be our final topic for tonight. Yeah, no worries. Cheers. All right. In that case, we'll go ahead and leave that there. And yeah, hopefully that was helpful. And then we might cover more of this next week once I've had some time to look over it properly.
What did you say the calcium did to this Starling curve?
Calcium is going to go ahead, and so whether you're using a drug or epinephrine, we did another curve for epinephrine. Either way, they're going to shift it up and to the left because they release more calcium. So the drugs are making more calcium come out, the epinephrine's making more calcium come out. Just two different ways of talking to the calcium. All right. Enjoy your evenings. Cheers. Yeah, no worries.